Hi, I'm Auntie Tam, and welcome to my channel. If you're new here, please like and subscribe. Click that little bell icon so that you can get more mental health content. And if you are a returning viewer, welcome back. And today we are marking the beginning of our series on trauma. So I normally deal with mental health issues to do with mental health awareness, life skills, and life advice. I am not a psychiatrist, psychologist, counselor, or any kind of medical professional. Everything that I talk about comes from my own lived experience and the research I've done and the people I've spoken to in those fields so that I could bring you really good mental health content. If you would like to support me in creating more mental health content and better mental health content, please feel free to go into the link just in the box below. You'll find my Patreon and buy me a coffee so that if you do fancy um, pushing a few bucks my way so that I could improve my channel. And now this series, I must just tell you, we are working with trauma. And this series will be going through September and possibly October as well. And we are going to be looking at what trauma is, how to deal with it, PTSD, complex PTSD, spousal or domestic abuse, other forms of abuse, what trauma does to the brain, what trauma does to the body. And so I must just warn you up ahead that the content that you are about to see will contain quite possibly references to physical, sexual, mental, even spiritual violence against another person. It may also contain discussions on suicide. I will obviously give you a warning at the beginning of each video so that you know what to expect, because I know that some of these topics are difficult for some people to deal with and they may be disturbing for some of the viewers. So if that's the case, just click away, watch something else, watch kittens play. Wonderful. Um, you're under no obligation to watch the entire video. What I will say is that I've created the series out of my own understanding and personal experiences with trauma, and I understand how many people out there do experience it, and they're not actually aware of how it impacts their daily lives going forward. So the whole purpose of this video series is to educate people about trauma and to bring awareness to the mental health issues that can become attached to trauma. So I really hope you enjoy this series, and let's get going. Hi, welcome to our very first episode of um, our trauma series. And the very first question we're asking is, what is trauma exactly? Trauma is an event that has taken place or a situation in your life, or a series of events or a set of circumstances, which is incredibly, it poses harm or a threat to you, and strongly, strongly affects the way you function in the world, who you are in the world, how you see the world. It can impair you mentally, emotionally, physically, sexually, across the board. Um, it's quite, and it's because I've experienced trauma myself. It's quite, I think, self-explanatory when you say to you, I've experienced trauma. But I think also, in some respects, people have said, okay, oh, that's traumatic, when when it wasn't actually, because it's become a word that's been watered down a little, I think, in some instances. Now, from what I understand from the research I've done, there are three kinds of trauma. One is acute trauma, and as the name suggests, acute, it happens in immediately in a very short space of time. That could pop up from a single incident. Say, for example, perhaps a car accident would be an acute trauma. Um, Chronic trauma is the second kind, and this is what they describe as repeated and prolonged. That's, I'm quoting, repeated and prolonged um, trauma. Now, this is what you would probably find in situations where there is domestic abuse or some sort of violence or abuse in the home. I would even say this is part of growing up in poverty or in a poor country or being present while there is a war happening. Um, Complex trauma is the third kind, and this is exposure, like when you've experienced um, a number of traumatic events of different kinds, um, and they are often, as is described here, and I am quoting here, often of an invasive interpersonal nature. Trauma can occur to you with you at any age, it in any circumstance. It When we're talking about complex trauma, I think war would also fit under that. I think that also, well, living, say, in there are certain areas of South Africa, um, particularly in Cape Town, where there are a lot of gangs growing up in these neighborhoods, you would be exposed to what they say varied and multiple traumatic events. When I was working in news, we would often have reports of, you know, in areas like that where there would be rape, there would be gang shootings, there would be drug abuse and selling drug wars. So that would probably fall under complex because there's a whole number of different things happening in those societies and areas that can affect an individual. And geez, that's so awful. And I would also imagine that women, particularly living in countries or under specific religions that suppress their power and suppress their rights, would also be part of this whole complex trauma thing, because I would imagine that they are being put through a lot at home and in society. So I would imagine that that's also something that they would experience. Um, so here's a list. They give you a list here of different kinds of trauma. I'm just going to read it out. Natural disasters, like hurricanes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, sexual abuse, physical abuse, domestic violence. They say medical injury, illness, or procedure. So I would say that's incredibly fair. Operations, injuries, definitely is I would without a doubt. Community violence. Now that's what we were talking about in those neighborhoods where there's gang problems and gang wars. Neglect or deprivation. Traumatic grief. And I'm glad this is in there because I do believe that there are instances where grief is traumatic, particularly if the person that you know who has died in a horrific way, or they've taken their own lives. It's, yeah. Um, Crime, definitely. Kidnapping, accidents, school violence, and I'm putting bullying under there as well, and loss. Now, I'm going to add my own in there. I would say working in a toxic environment, so a toxic, emotionally toxic environment, that I would think would come in as chronic abuse. If the company you're working for is particularly toxic and abusive, I would put that in there. I would also put bullying under that chronic trauma as well, chronic and complex trauma. And remember that bullying doesn't just happen between kids. It's cyberbullying, it's work bullying, it's being bullied by members of your own family in one shape or another. So we're not looking at just um, you know name calling. We're really looking at the heavy stuff. Now, they say that trauma, when you are um, developing, when you're a child and you're growing, chronic trauma can actually affect the brain's development. If you think about it, when we are confronted with something dangerous, as animals, because we are animals, human beings are actually primates, we have to choose. There's the flight, fight, or freeze, and so that we go into. And when we are in that state constantly because we're in an abusive situation, whether that abuse is occurring at home or school or elsewhere, that abuse keeps that brain in that heightened state. So that's always switched on. That which which creates this hypervigilance amongst people who've experienced trauma, especially growing up. And I would imagine also that would be what people in suppressive societies. And please don't think I'm using the word suppressive in the frickin' Scientology way. I'm not. In oppressive, let's say, oppressive societies, in societies where there's a lot of crime or gang wars, that's what I would imagine. And the thing is with that, it has a long-term impact. It's insidious. When that child grows up, their behavior is affected, the way they see the world, their emotional development, the way they communicate, their mental health, their physical health, everything is affected. And I would tell you as well, if you have experienced trauma as well, those things impact you as an adult as well. There really is, and I've described this to some people before. There really is like there's a wall in your life that comes down, and on the one side is the person you were before the trauma. On the other side is the person you are after the trauma. Now, we're going to talk about this in the series, about who you were before and after. But it really does feel like the person you were before, it's not the same person anymore because this thing happened, car accident. I mean, and I would say even witnessing a car accident, even witnessing, driving past the accident scene, in news, we would constantly, even though I wasn't out in the field, I was a sub-editor, so I was sitting behind the scenes, we would have about a row of 6 to 8 televisions keeping track of various news agencies and what was happening. And you would get out of the corner of your eye, you'd see pictures from the war in Ukraine. From the corner of this eye, this is happening, that eye, that's happening. So actually working in the news field became a traumatic experience for me. And we will be talking about later on PTSD and complex PTSD, because that does happen, particularly when we're talking about the events that can trigger a trauma response. And I hope that this introduction has been helpful to you and that you will stay tuned for the next video, in which we will be looking at the person you were before and the person you were after your trauma. So please stay with us, and I hope you enjoy the series.